Father Tadeusz Pacholczyk, Ph.D., serves as the Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia and directs the center's National Catholic Certification Program in Healthcare Ethics. And he is our primary speaker for tonight. Welcome, Father Tad Pacholczyk.
Well, tremendous pleasure to be able to be with you this evening. Thanks for showing up the evening ahead of even the big event. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here today. So the topic that I'm interested in dealing with this evening, I think you'd agree it's a fairly controversial topic, certainly in the culture at large, but I think even within our church. I think this is an area where we haven't really succeeded on a lot of levels with messaging well around this important question that's in a certain way at the center of married life for many people. So I'm hoping for the opportunity to kind of give you some rationale to think with me, about the wisdom of the church's teaching here. I'm convinced that the church's teaching at the end of the day is really a liberating kind of a teaching. And, a lot of times we think of, or at least it's framed for us, that what the church offers us is in some way repressive and limiting who we can become, while it's exactly the opposite. To the extent we embrace the fullness of this truth, it's a transformational reality for us. So I want to start out and just share with you my own personal encounter with Humanae Vitae, with this document dealing with the church's teaching on contraception. So I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. I just flew in from there earlier today. And I remember when I was 15 years old, I walked into the back of St. Odelia's parish. And I was at this point in my life where I was kind of having a conversion from being Catholic to being Catholic, if you know what I mean. Getting really earnest about things. And so I walked into the back of this church. I was starting to, go to daily Mass, and I would sometimes drop into the church just to visit our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. As I walked in the back, there was a little table, and there was a copy of this document, Humanae Vitae. I picked it up. I said, "What's this?" I started flipping through it, and I started to read it. And I stood there, and I read page after page after page. And I finished it, standing there at the back of the church, and I closed the last page, and I said to myself, "Oh my goodness, I've always heard that the church opposes contraception in marriage, and I had no clue why. And now I get it." So for me, it was like this light bulb, went off over the top of my head, and it was the beginning, really, of, a lot more investigation than on my part, reading and, as it were, digging into the wisdom of the church around this. So obviously, with a story like that, I'm going to say to you, if you have not read this document, and especially because there are free copies of it, I understand, that are available at this conference, please get a copy of it. Please read it. I consider it, really one of the highlights of the entire papacy of Pope Paul VI. So this question about contraception has, I think, a kind of cultural matrix that a lot of us are not even really very much in tune with. I know I've grown up and contraception has always been just accepted. People do it, Catholics do it, it's out there. But interestingly, in 1879, the state of Connecticut enacted strong legislation outlawing contraception. And they specified it as the use of any drug, medicinal article, or instrument for the purpose of preventing conception. So this was actually encoded in the laws. Amazing. Now what was behind this? Well, first, I mean, this is worth noting that this was similar to the laws in other states, and it was in effect for nearly 90 years before it was reversed in 1965. So what's behind this, I think, is that it codified this long-standing dictate of the public conscience that contraception was harmful to society because it promoted promiscuity, adultery, and other evils. It relied on the nearly universal sensibility that children should be seen as a blessing to society, fundamental insight, and that a healthy society, however tolerant at the margins, must be based on the notion that sex is essentially procreative, with its proper locus in a loving family. So you might say that whole notion has kind of come apart at the seams in the wake of this adjusted attitude towards contraception. And certainly the family has come under crisis from a number of fronts, and contraception has certainly had some role in that. And I think, the sense of promoting promiscuity and adultery, all of us can see that, right? Because if you can mask the effects of sexual activity with others, it sort of opens the door to that temptation quite a bit more strongly. So this view, this cultural view, had been remarkably deeply ingrained in Western society for millennia. And until the 1930s, believe it or not, all Protestant denominations agreed with Catholic teaching condemning contraception in marriage. All Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, and early Protestant theologians, including Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and Wesley, rejected contraception. Now, the Protestants won't tell you that, but if you do a little digging, you can find quotations from Martin Luther where he's saying, this is something that should never be part of marriage. This is always disordered and wrong. The Church of England in 1930 held the famous Lambeth Conference, which was sort of the cracking open of the door. What happened at this conference? Well, it was the first instance where any responsible authority, not simply in Christendom, but in any culture, had publicly supported the use of contraception. So nobody expected this to happen, but they basically said there are some very limited circumstances in marriage, and the Anglican bishops said, in those very limited set of circumstances, it should be allowable for a couple to use contraception. Pope Pius XI was so distressed by this action of the Anglicans that he wrote his encyclical called Casti Connubii on chaste marriage in response to the Lambeth Conference. So what did he say? In order that she, the Catholic Church, may preserve the chastity of the nuptial union, any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature. That, of course, has always been the Christian position. And today, regrettably, the only Christians who are insisting on this same timeless teaching really is the Catholic Church. We have become, in a sense, the standard bearers here. So, an offense against the law of God and of nature. Notice that nature is mentioned. I want to spend a little time with you thinking through, what is it about contraception that is against nature and against God's law? And to do that, I want to just emphasize something, which is that I think you can sometimes approach questions of right and wrong by saying, all right, well, if you take the pill, what kind of bad things can happen to you? Oh, maybe you can get some, of the cancers, or, maybe it's going to cause mood swings in women, and then you start listing all kinds of bad effects, and then you say, so therefore it's got to be wrong. Versus, what's the intrinsic design and order that God has given us for our sexuality that calls on us to respect that beautiful design. And I'm going to focus more on this first one, not so much on the second. But just to give you a hint of the second, when taken for lifestyle purposes, the pill, the birth control pill, is the opposite of healthcare, being in fact detrimental to women's health, in light of its frequent side effects of weight gain, headaches, and depression, as well as its heightened and well-documented risk of thrombotic stroke, myocardial infarction, which is heart attack, and breast cancer. Interestingly, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, an arm of the World Health Organization, classifies hormonal contraception as a Group 1 carcinogen. Fascinating, huh? We're putting carcinogens into our bodies. All right, but that's pretty much all I'm going to say in terms of those detrimental effects. And I want to focus instead here, I mean, you can see there's obviously problems, and it's a reminder to us that the moral law that God gives us is really a beautiful and liberating law in the sense that when we follow that law, we do avoid many of the harms that will accrue from bad choices that we make. All right, so when we talk about the designs of our human sexuality, we can say that sex was ordained by God in order to unite man and woman as one flesh, and to bring children into the world. Its unique and proper context is marriage. So kind of a global statement here to get us started. Marriage provides children with the loving and stable environment they need for growth and formation. And we all know how long it takes to kind of bring a human to adulthood, right? And how much incredible hard work it is, loving work by parents who dedicate themselves to this. So that unit of the family, of those who are consecrated to each other in marriage, so critically important. All right, so Humanae Vitae, sections 11 and 12, kind of a core teaching, and I want to share this with you and reflect on it with you a little bit. The Church, quote, teaches that each and every marriage act, and this is the Latin phrase, quilibet matrimoni usus, must remain open to the transmission of life. That teaching, often set forth by the magisterium, is founded upon the inseparable connection, willed by God, and unable to be broken by man on his own initiative, between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. All right, so it ends up here saying sex has a design with kind of two key pieces, unitive, procreative. Those terms, unitive and procreative, I think they're a little bit they sound like the language of specialists, don't they? What would be some more kind of pedestrian, standard ways of describing those two things? Can any of you think of another way to explain to somebody, maybe to a kid, what do we mean by unitive and procreative as the ends to which sex is ordered in marriage? Any other thoughts? Anyone want to put up a hand and give a try? Yes? Bonding. Good. Bonding for the unitive. How about... all right, yours is on my next slide, but that's very good. Life-giving act, love-giving act, right? That's one way to explain this very simply. Life-giving and love-giving between the spouses. But then, as you said, babies and bonding. Sex is for babies and bonding. That captures really what's at the heart of the Church's teaching. Unitive and procreative is just the sort of fancy way to say it. So this traditional understanding runs like this. Sexual activity that is intrinsically non-procreative or non-life-giving or intentionally rendered non-procreative has always been seen as immoral. So what are some examples? Obviously contraception, the focus of our talk tonight, but a few other things can be included. Masturbation, oral and anal sex to completion, and homosexuality. And tomorrow we'll have a talk on same-sex attraction and some of those issues. So one might formulate it something like this. This is kind of how you would see it written in some of the old theology manuals. Rather explicit, but very clear. Achieving orgasm for any reason other than spousal charity within marriage is contra naturam, against nature, disordered. So this is obviously a very unique context in which sexual activity is meant to be shared, and with a very special order that needs to be respected. All right, so sometimes people will say, well, you know, gee, in my marriage, we really have been mostly open to life. You know, we have 3 kids, but, you know, there's also been some challenges, and there have been times when we, you know, went on the pill or I used a condom, or we've really been mostly open to life. And I think there's a flaw in that kind of argument. Being mostly open to life in marriage is actually the same kind of logic as being mostly faithful in marriage. It just doesn't really work that way. You're either faithful or you're not. You're either open to life or you're not. Because of the nature of what our human sexuality calls on, in terms of our involvement and exclusive commitment to each other, there's not a way that we can be mostly open. You're either open or you're not in that moment, that reality of one flesh union. All right, so what about this logic, so to speak, of it being against nature? How can we sort of flesh this out a bit? We should never act directly against a good. So while we're under no obligation to realize all the goods of which we're capable, we are obliged never to act against a good, treating it as though it were an evil, right? I mean, that's something I think all of us know. Now, a little bit of preface here. There's a common Catholic mistake out there, which is to emphasize artificial contraception. It's artificial contraception. You hear people use that phrase, artificial contraception. The issue is simply contraception, not artificial contraception. Whether one is engaged in artificial contraception, or if there were a natural contraception, it is still contra. And it's the contra part that's really the problem here. So notice how I've broken the word up here, contraception. Notice this always entails an act other than the conjugal act, which is directed expressly against the realization of the procreative good inherent in the act in which one has freely chosen to engage. And it treats a good as though it were an evil by this other act. Because notice, it's an act other than the conjugal act, right? Somebody's rolling on a condom. Somebody is taking a pill in anticipation to act counter to the act of sexual intimacy and its order. So there's a second act layered on here. All right, now there's an argument out there that goes like this, and I think a lot of you have probably heard this argument. Well, abortion is a terrible evil, but in order to stop abortion, we've got to get out there and push contraception. Contraception is the answer to avoiding abortions. Pope John Paul II and many other people have pushed back against this kind of a claim. It's not a reasonable claim, because contraception and abortion are two very similar realities. Let me explain why. First, it turns out that many forms of birth control actually are abortifacient. They may cause the loss of an early pregnancy. And this, depends on the details, because sometimes these drugs are supposed to be preventing the release of an egg out of the woman's ovum, out of her ovary, but there are breakthrough ovulations, and those will sometimes result in a conception, and then they will change the lining of the uterus so that the arriving embryo can't successfully attach himself or herself to the uterus. So that's a kind of abortifacient mechanism. It also involves an anti-life mentality, doesn't it? You're saying, I don't want a life right now. And a lot of times people will say, if I do get pregnant on contraception, what's the backup? Pope St. John Paul II affirmed that abortion and contraception are, as he put it, fruits of the same tree. That was in Humanae Vitae number 13. Even secular authorities, our much esteemed Supreme Court, in its 1992 Casey decision, put it this way: abortion is of the same character as the decision to use contraception. For 2 decades of economic and social development, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. 2 fruits of the same tree. So, contraception is fundamentally anti-life. All right, so the Church's teaching around this, I want to suggest to you, is a very reasonable kind of teaching. And I want to think it through from a couple of different angles here. Reasonable human behavior is to act on behalf of ends perceived as goods, right? You see certain things that are good, you're drawn towards them, and you try to realize those goods because they are good. Those good ends become the principles of human activity. Ends make sense of a given act, indeed make it possible. This morning, let's say in front of your house, you're looking out the window, and you look across the street, and you see Mildred McGillicuddy dash out of her house in her bathrobe, and a second or two later, her husband comes running after her, and he kind of captures her and retrieves her. And you say, oh, well, there goes Mildred again. She's in fairly advanced dementia, and she's just kind of randomly going out of her house at various times if she's not, kept secure. Versus maybe this morning, if you were in Tucson and you saw me walk out of the family house there, you'd say, oh, Father Tad walked out of the house. Now, why did he walk out of the house? Oh, because he has to get in the car. Why? Oh, because he's going to the airport. Why? Oh, because he's going to be speaking in Houston about okay, so you see the good that's motivating that series of steps and choices that I'm making about intentional activity. So what is the term for the end-directedness of an act? This is a little bit of a technical term. I want to see if anybody happens to know this term here. The end-directedness of an act is sort of that for which you are doing it. Starts with the letter T. Does anybody know that word? Yes. Very good. He said telos, or teleology. Same root. It's a Greek word. A little bit, this sounds a bit area of specialist, but it's really not, as you're going to see. This is a very important term. Teleology, seeing the purpose or telos of a process, can reveal authentic goods to us, which can then guide the moral choices we make. We are able to recognize the telos of many different processes in the world. The telos of fire is to generate heat and to consume combustibles. The telos of an acorn is to become an oak tree. We can see that this is what its end-directedness involves. And we're going to want to look at that very same question in terms of our sexuality. The telos of human sexuality is to draw man and woman together to produce offspring and raise children in the family unit. Anyone in a high school biology class already understands this end or purpose of sex. This is so foundational, but it's funny how it sort of slips from our gaze in a society that has gone off its rails in certain respects. The meaning is objectively rooted in the marital act itself, not arbitrarily imposed. This isn't something that we're sort of, layering on. It's something that's right there. It's the way the whole thing is constructed from within. I love the phrase, the marital act. That act that is privileged and reserved to the arena of marriage. It's a very unique, very beautiful, very sacred reality. Our society has cheapened it in so many ways. So, contraception as acting against the telos. Anytime a married couple engages in sexual activity that has been intentionally made sterile by contraception, they are powerfully acting against the telos of the sexual act they share. Elizabeth Anscombe, well-known philosopher, notes how their act is no longer the kind of act by which life is transmitted, but is purposely rendered infertile and so changed to another sort of act altogether. It's not even the kind of act it's supposed to be. Now a different act. So another example, just to think about this, the act of eating is objectively good. The telos is to nourish and hydrate and support other goods of the body as we eat. Bulimia involves extreme overeating followed by self-induced vomiting and purging. We engage in wrongful activity by acting contrary to the telos of the act of eating in this fashion. And we can discern those real goods and sense the duty, the obligation to safeguard them in our chosen behaviors. So, the ends of marriage then, the telos, once again, procreation, mutual support or union, and sometimes you'll also see this listed. It is a remedy of concupiscence. So the sexual pleasure that couples share together helps remedy the strong sexual drives and urges that are part of our nature and sometimes of our struggles. All right, so if one of the ends, if the telos of marriage is procreation, which it clearly is, are we meant to have as many children as possible? Putting it a little bit baldly, but clearly the answer would be no. And we have to look at it from this vantage point. What is God's intention when it comes to spacing pregnancies? And again, Humanae Vitae, this marvelous document, deals with this so clearly. If then there are serious motives to space out births, as there often are, right, which derive from the physical or psychological conditions of husband and wife, or from external conditions, like, financial conditions, the Church teaches that it is then licit, meaning allowable, to take into account the natural rhythms immanent in the generative functions for the use of marriage in the infecund or infertile periods only, and in this way to regulate birth without offending the moral principles which have been recalled earlier. So this relies on the fact, on the reality, that women are not always fertile. And it's possible to determine spaces in a woman's cycle when she is not fertile, and to time intercourse appropriately. So this is referred to as natural family planning, or the preferred term would be fertility awareness-based methods, FABM. Again, the danger of using the word natural, just because it's natural, it's automatically good. Well, no, not necessarily. It's the fact that this is not, in fact, contraception at all. So I want to explain the difference between contraception and natural family planning. Because sometimes the accusation will be made something like this. Well, for Catholics, this is just a Catholic form of birth control. That's what people will say. Well, while both may have the same intent, postponing pregnancy. The difference lies in the means themselves. With natural family planning, the couple does not act against the marital act itself. Rather, the character of the act is respected for what it is. So notice that underline. You're not acting against the act itself. We need to think about this and see how true this really is. In every single instance, it is chosen as a free human act, recognizing and accepting that part of its natural design includes infertile spaces in the woman's cycle. The decision not to engage in the act, not tonight, honey, kind of thing, is never an instance of an act against the marital act itself. Unlike the case of using a condom, where you are saying, for this specific act, I want to foreclose any option, any possibility of handing on the beautiful gift of life. You're never saying that here. You're just saying, not tonight, because we're not obligated to have sex all the time. When a couple impedes the inherent procreative powers of that act through the use of a condom, a pill, or other means, they engage in contradictory behavior by seeking to perform the act on the one hand while simultaneously blocking or stifling it on the other. In natural family planning, on the other hand, they are not directing any countermeasures towards the fertility of a specific conjugal or marital act. The natural order and the telos of the act is respected. It's regular marital relations. It just happens to be the case that the woman's not always fertile. As Janet Smith and Christopher Kaiser observe, these are two important commentators, Catholic commentators on this, contracepting couples make themselves infertile. NFP couples work with an infertility that is natural. And it uses an entirely different kind of discipline between husband and wife to say mutually to each other, we will not have marital relations now. All right, so I want to share with you some analogies here that I find helpful in thinking through contraception, but also in thinking through the difference between contraception and NFP. So would it be normal for a wife to insert earplugs while trying to listen attentively to or carry on a conversation with her husband? It's kind of a rhetorical question, right? I mean, of course not. This would be a disaster if this were how, the woman approached this. Well, the earplugs do bespeak the view that I don't really want to hear you and be with you, disrupting authentic mutual communication. So if a woman inserts a cervical diaphragm or a vaginal sponge while having intercourse, she is likewise employing a language of the body that says she doesn't really want to communicate openly and fully with her husband. She wants to keep part of who he is at a distance, at arm's length. That is to say, she shuns his fertility and fruitfulness. That's the real language that's being spoken here between two who have professed to give themselves completely to each other. All right, second analogy, specifically on contraception and NFP, seeing the difference. A woman wants to talk to her husband each evening and to tell him about the events of her day. He, on the other hand, wants to relax by listening to baseball on the radio. He's not too interested in listening closely. So he decides that while he's listening to his wife talk, he will at the same time plug in a hidden mini earphone and follow the game. So his attention will be divided between his wife and the game. You can see another recipe brewing here for disaster. He will occasionally say things like, yes, dear, and uh-huh, to give the impression that he's listening to her with full attention. A woman on the pill similarly gives the impression that she is receiving her husband fully in the marital embrace, while in fact she is shutting down her own fertility in order to reject his life-giving masculinity. She speaks a false language to him with her body, like the sports-minded husband with his mini earphone and "yes, dear" responses. If a man uses a condom with his wife, or even if both spouses agree to use contraception, they still speak a false and inauthentic language to one another, right at the core of their shared intimacy. But let's look at a slightly different case here now, and you'll see the comparison with natural family planning. Suppose that on alternating days of the week, the sports-minded husband agrees to stop listening to the radio and instead visits with his wife in a direct and focused manner. All his attention will be on her. Both spouses agree to delay their gratification. He practices sports abstinence, she practices verbal abstinence, but they do this on alternating days, rather than acting against the good of their personal communication by employing countermeasures like earphones. So, Monday, he's going to listen very closely. Tuesday, on the other hand, he'll be able to listen to the radio and she'll agree to be verbally abstinent. This is similar to the case of a couple using NFP. On some days, they fully share with each other in the conjugal act. On other days, they delay sexual gratification and freely choose abstinence together so as to avoid speaking inauthentically to each other through contraceptive sex. All right, third analogy. Would it be normal to surgically excise healthy vocal cords and then try to carry on a conversation with our spouse? Again, this is another sort of rhetorical question. The answer is of course not. Opting for a vasectomy and then pursuing sex involves a similar contradictory language of the body. So this notion of the language of the body, that the body has authentic and false ways of speaking. And these can be very, very damaging in a marriage if we start speaking falsely to each other. Fourth analogy. When a husband puts on a condom during intercourse, he disrupts that intimate communication that is written right into the language of his body, much as if he had wrapped his mouth in a cellophane or tape covering, trying to have a verbal conversation with his wife. All right, so these analogies, I think, give us a sense of some rather subtle goods that are easily sort of overturned, overturning apple carts kind of thing. We can do it almost sometimes without realizing it. And sometimes, I think in marriages, it may be the kind of thing that even doesn't sort of manifest itself until some time, even years into a marriage, that couples realize, hey, there's something here that's not right. There's something, that's not harmonious between us. Why is this? And it's because they don't even see that they've been speaking not authentically to each other. All right, so Professor William May sums this up very nicely. I use his textbook. He's deceased now, but he's written a great textbook called Catholic Bioethics and the Gift of Human Life. And here's a passage from it. A person does not put on gloves to touch a beloved one tenderly, unless one thinks that some disease may be communicated. But is pregnancy a disease? And is not the use of condoms, diaphragms, spermicidal jellies, and the like similar to putting on gloves? Do husband and wife really become one flesh if they must arm themselves with protective gear before giving themselves to one another genitally? Very, very powerful. I think he captures the nub of the issue, if you will. All right, so again in Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI addresses what does it mean, responsible parenthood? Because sometimes, again, people will say, oh, Catholics don't have any notion of responsible parenthood, and they're all expected to have huge families. All these other caricatures that are not true and not accurate. And Pope Paul VI gave a good, clear explanation when he said, in relation to physical, economic, and psychological and social conditions, responsible parenthood is exercised either by the deliberate and generous decisions to raise a numerous family, or by the decision made for grave motives and with due respect for the moral law to avoid, for the time being, or even for an indeterminate period, a new birth. So there clearly will be legitimate grounds that couples will recognize, maybe it's financial, maybe there's a health concern. The last child that she had, it was a very, very dangerous pregnancy. And there's concern that if she gets pregnant too soon again, that this could fulminate and turn into a life-threatening pregnancy, etc. And therefore we need to space and, track how she's doing before we return to sharing marital intimacy, etc. So the recognition that there is clearly an understanding of responsible parenthood. So the Church, at the end of the day, is always calling us to bring order to the reality of very powerful sexual drives and impulses that are part of our human situation. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 2339, I think, sums it up quite nicely. Chastity includes an apprenticeship in self-mastery, which is a training in human freedom. Boy, how much is packed into that line. The alternative is clear. Either man governs his passions and finds peace, or he lets himself be dominated by them and becomes unhappy. Man's dignity, therefore, requires him to act out of conscious and free choice, as moved and drawn in a personal way from within, and not by blind impulses in himself, or by mere external constraint. So this is obviously a high calling, and it is a calling that affects both those who are married and those who are not. And it requires grace. The reality of grace, that in all things we're always submitting ourselves to the support and help of the Lord God so that we can grow, change, and be transformed and discover the beauty of order in ourselves and in especially our close relationships. All right, so Janet Smith sums it up this way, and then we'll close and we have some time for questions. Janet Smith, by the way, some of you may have bumped into her famous, it was in the old days, cassette tape. And the cassette tape, you could buy it, and it was entitled Contraception, Why Not? She was a professor at Sacred Heart Seminary, and this cassette tape went viral. I know you can't really talk about cassette tapes going viral the same way that you do with stuff on the internet today, but it really did go viral for the time. So here's how she sums it up. The Church teaches that acts of contraception are always against the plan of God for human sexuality, since God intended that each and every act of spousal intercourse express both the intention to make a complete unitive gift of oneself to one's spouse and the willingness to be a parent with one's spouse. These meanings of the spousal act are, as Humanae Vitae stated, inseparable. Very, very beautiful reality that she has captured so nicely here and really summarized, I think, Pope Paul VI's document so well. All right, before we go to the questions, hopefully you're writing your questions and handing them in We're collecting them, and then we'll have opportunity to discuss some of those. I want to mention a certification program that I started together with Dr. John Haas, our former president at the NCBC. If you're saying to yourself, this Catholic medical ethics and bioethics, it's a really interesting area and I'd like to learn more, check out our online 1-year web-based program. It's an opportunity, it involves weekly assignments that you submit by email. There's a couple of in-person requirements where you have to show up once in Philadelphia at the end of the program and once at one of our regional seminars, which are held in different parts of the country. But it's a great opportunity to kind of get a layman's more informed view, really, of what the Church teaches and of her great wisdom in so many of these areas of controversy in medical ethics and bioethics. And there are also some master's degree possibilities after you finish our program, if you're really serious, about studying further. All right, so thank you very much. And we will take a few questions. I see that they're being collected here. Thank you. And just to mention a couple of quick resources, check out our website. Also, I have a personal website with a lot of good resources. And we'd now like to open the floor to shorter speeches disguised as questions, he says. Actually, we're going to deal with them through the cards. So.
We trust you, but
yes, this
is going to be better. Okay. Wow. One more hand for Father Tad. That was absolutely incredible.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm told that the microphones are interacting, so I'm going to stand over here.
Okay, that's a good idea.
And read these to you. So the first one here. How would you approach or talk to a person who does not desire children, but does desire marriage? What would you say to them?
Ooh, that's a great one. Yeah. They say to their potential spouse, no matter what, I never want kids. That's a problem. That's a big problem. The Church would say that's not the appropriate approach to entering matrimony. And if you do that, this will actually potentially serve as grounds for annulment, meaning that you didn't have a valid marriage that occurred. So this is very important to make sure that it gets discussed thoroughly and vetted, and to say, do you mean you're absolutely closed to the possibility of having kids with me? And if that answer is yes, then that marriage should not go forward, if there's that kind of strict, absolute closure around it. In other words, intending, by my intention, never to have kids. All right, it's about the intention in that particular case.
Very clear answer. There are very few young people in this room. How do we, as parents of adult children, have conversations about the Church's teaching with regard to contraception?
Some of the things that are made available to young people in terms of formational moments and teaching moments before confirmation, catechism, that these things are almost never dealt with, right? Nobody seems to, it's like, I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I feel like it's out of my league as, the catechism teacher here. I just want to talk about the Bible kind of thing. And so I think that's something we have to work on within our own household. Because the reality is that kids have plenty of information that's immediately available on the internet, and a lot of it is problematic, and they're going very quickly to, feed themselves there. Now, even as I say that, there are many good resources on the internet, and I think part of what we have to do today is to encourage kids to investigate some of those resources, and to not just sort of, go for the lowest common denominator kind of material.
Please address serious reasons to avoid or postpone pregnancy. If we want to save for a house or another car, does that count as a serious reason?
Okay. If we want to save for another house or a car, a financial sort of argument, is that a legitimate reason? What the church says here is that it's up to the spouses together to discern God's design in your marriage, but be sure that you are, as it were, erring on the side of generosity. So you're going to have to figure out some questions, and financial ones can be a little challenging. Now, just because I need another car? That, I think we'd all agree, doesn't sound like a very strong or legitimate or serious or grave reason to avoid a conception. But if you're in a situation where you've had 4 kids and you just lost your job, then you're saying to yourself, financially, I don't think we can have a 5th kid right now. There's a lot of stress because I lost my job, and haven't been able to find anything right away. Then clearly that's going to be the kind of thing that, in consultation with your wife, you may both agree, yeah, this is not the time. We need to abstain during the fertile periods here because we have a grave reason to avoid a pregnancy. Health issues, I think, are another one that are pretty straightforward. When it becomes apparent that there are significant risks to the life of the mother, that's going to constitute a grave or serious reason to avoid a pregnancy. There will be other reasons that might arise. They might be reasons even at times related to concerns perhaps about mental health, maybe of the mother, or maybe of the father, but more likely oftentimes of the mother. And again, too much stress, and that may constitute. But these are the things that they require, in a certain sense, doing this through good communication between spouses. And this is kind of a sensitive area. Talking about sex is not such an easy thing. At least that's been my experience in talking with couples. Having sex is pretty easy, but talking about it is not so easy sometimes. So, getting the good communication piece is very, very valuable to work on as a couple. And then with that, also on your knees to discern these matters. Say, really, what is it that God is doing here in our family? And am I being generous in what He's offering? And that will usually give you what you need to know whether you have a serious or grave reason to space children.
Is there a possibility that NFP may be used with the wrong telos?
Yes. And this sort of harkens back to the first question. One could go into a marriage and have a very, very closed attitude. So I don't want many kids. I'm not even sure I want one. But the church says we can use NFP, so let's just use NFP and never have any kids kind of thing. That would be a problem as well, because I think you would be saying that you have grave reasons when you probably do not. It's just an attitudinal thing that you've got, your own preferences that you want to rule the roost. So NFP could be misused. It could definitely, it's not automatically moral to do NFP, but if it's done right with proper intentions, it's a beautiful and moral part of a marriage.
Would you say that in regards to the act itself, it's always moral?
Yes, in regard to the act itself, in the sense that the decision to abstain is generally not going to be problematic. Now, there's this other piece, right, that we say when you get married, there is a certain right that accrues to each of the spouses, husband to wife, wife to husband, a certain right over each other that includes shared intimacy. So you can't have a marriage, where one of them is saying, we're never going to have any sex, period. And the other one is saying, but I want to have sex, that's part of the reason we got married. That's a problem. There's a problem. Now, there's some, unusual situations where you can have marriage without sex, as with the Blessed Mother and Saint Joseph. They, probably belonged to the Essenes, which was a special group in Israel that, had some practices around this. But those tend to be, more exceptional situations. And for most people, there should not be this sort of foreclosing completely on sexual sharing.
So does this mean that married couples are never to engage in oral sex?
Okay, this is kind of a complicated one.
Only the best.
Yeah, only the hard ones. So oral sex, I think that a lot of people would say, first, there's going to be some spouses who are going to say simply, this is something that I find kind of repugnant or, not appealing. And I think if that's the case in a marriage, the other spouse needs to be very attuned to that and respectful of that. But if there is mutual agreement, and let's say there's a need for this in anticipation of completing the marital act the normal way, that it's only, like stimulation of each other to get ready, then that probably doesn't raise any significant moral concerns. But if it's oral sex to completion, orgasm is achieved because of that, yes, that is improper. That is a failure to respect the designs of complete self-giving, body to body, one to the other. It's a form, in that way, of just, if you will, mutual stimulation or even mutual masturbation then, and that's problematic.
Is a marriage rendered invalid if a couple practices artificial contraception on their wedding night?
No. It would not be rendered invalid on their wedding night if they use contraception. This is something, however, that should be brought to confession and clear the decks with the Lord Jesus and go forward in the marriage without that component as a continuing practice.
These are really good questions. I'm trying to like put them in the best order here to make use of our time. So can you speak to the historical causes of how do we go from rejecting contraception as a culture to embracing it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have a simple answer for culturally what happened here. I think it's a culmination of many pieces. So there were movements like Margaret Sanger, who were individuals who kind of gathered with other like-minded individuals who became very vocal in saying we do need to have things like abortion, we do need to have contraception widely available, and sometimes for understandable motivations even, where they would say it seems like in this marriage the dynamic is totally off and the woman is almost being subjected to like sexual assault by her husband, and they would use extreme examples to then make a case that this is something that should be allowed. And then of course privacy arguments, these are used a lot to say, oh well, then there's certain areas where everything needs to be private, and in virtue of that privacy we should not impose laws by the state. But I'd like to remind people that we don't really believe that about privacy. People will say, well, abortion is a right to privacy and contraception should be as well. But if you say abortion is a right, should fall under the heading of the right to privacy, then you're basically saying, well, there are certain settings in which it's okay to kill your own offspring, to end their life. But would we ever say something like that simply for the parent of a 3-year-old? That you say, oh, because of privacy, if they decide to harm their 3-year-old child or kill their own 3-year-old child, that should be allowable in the name of privacy? No, of course not. So privacy is a good, but it clearly has limitations and parameters under which it has to be properly understood, and the ability to carry out evil in a sort of private way is not something that one should be guaranteeing through law. So, the question about culturally what's changed, I think, is a hard one. There are many elements. I think there was pressure from outside. I think there may have been some hesitation at times on the part of the church to engage these things, and Christians more broadly. And, I regret very much that the Protestants are not on the same page as us today on contraception. I'm just going to make a quick comment on this culturally, because I believe personally that contraception was a really, really key piece to the sort of unraveling of a lot of other related moral issues. So, for example, if you do contraception, you are basically saying, what is contraception? It's sex without babies, right? Well, if it's okay to have sex without babies, what about if you flip it around? How about having babies without sex? What's that? That's in vitro fertilization, right? That's making test tube babies. So you see, as soon as you separate the unitive and the procreative, you open up a Pandora's box. And that was something that happened very quickly in the wake of contraception. And I'll go one step further. How about the situation where you ask the question, what does contraception do to women? What does it say to women? Contraception neuters women, right? It says you're not going to be fertile. The reality of your fertility as a woman is not that important. What's important is, whatever people will say, getting women in the workplace, or getting women to do this, or getting women to do that. All right, so women, what are we saying when we do that? We're saying women are just another kind of man, and it's the men that really count. So you notice that's already moving in the direction of transgender. We're saying to women that your femininity is not actually that valuable and important. And it's hugely important. It's essential for the right order of everything. And then women start saying they want to be men, and men start saying they want to be women, and etc. So all of these things, at least in the psyche of the modern culture that we're a part of, are connected, I believe, back to the decision to allow and to use and rely on contraception.
Do you think that the reversal of Roe v. Wade today might start a process of reversing our acceptance of contraception?
Wow, boy.
Too early to tell?
Yeah, it is kind of early to tell, too early to tell, but I think what it's going to do, we had 50 years of abortion on demand, or 49, whatever it is, 50. And what happens when you do the same thing over and over for a long time? Everybody gets accustomed to it, right? And that's sort of where there's a certain malaise that hits you. And now that we have, this much vaunted institution, the Supreme Court, reversing itself, what is it going to do? It is going to prompt a lot of soul searching. It's going to prompt a lot of, asking important questions. I think this is a very pivotal and hope-filled moment that once again, in public discourse, where we have not been able to raise these questions and get a hearing, we will be able to. And so I think even contraception may kind of, be able to re-engage. That's my hope. That's my prayer.
This clarifying question came up twice, so I'm moving it to the front. If a man or a woman is infertile, naturally, or through vasectomy, or through menopause, is this the same thing as the oral sex? Should they abstain entirely then?
Okay, so let's talk maybe about the case of the vasectomy. if a man, let's say that he gets married to his wife, they have a couple kids, and then he decides, maybe unilaterally, that he's going to get a vasectomy, or maybe not. But then there's a realization, oh dear, why did I mutilate my own body here? And there's regret and repentance. Should they abstain? When this matter is brought to the confessional, many priests will say to the man who had the vasectomy something like this. They'll say, well, you clearly have repented and you understand the wrongness of what you did, but you also realize now that there's, in a sense, no consequences. When you have sex, there's no chance of pregnancy because of the vasectomy. So maybe you should ask yourself, and in your prayer to God, ask whether you and your wife should bring in some discipline of self-restraint, maybe along the lines of charting her cycle, noting her infertile periods, and together deciding to abstain during those fertile periods, as if you still had your fertility for your own spiritual growth. Now, that's a difficult proposal, and the confessors won't usually require that of their penitents, but they'll offer it sometimes. And I think, it is a helpful spiritual discipline to realize that you did something very, very serious to your own body here in an almost irreversible way. Now, the question of reversal will sometimes come up. Does a man have a moral duty to undo a vasectomy? And the Church has always said no, because this involves a second surgery which comports its own set of risks. It's not required, but the man could, on his own, make the decision that he will try to reverse the vasectomy. Sometimes you try and it fails, depending on how the vasectomy was done. It can be quite tricky to undo it.
What if the infertility arises from a natural or accidental means or through menopause? Is that different?
Okay, in that case, if it arises through a natural means or menopause, there's not an issue in terms of a moral obligation to abstain. There's not really even a question. It's just, it happened naturally and you regret it, but that's the state of affairs, and that's where you are. This is the deck that you were dealt by God. You lost your fertility, whether it was disease, whether it was you went off to Iraq and you got shot in such a way that you lost your fertility. Whatever it is, you just accept that and move forward as best you can.
So just to clarify, abstinence is not required in those circumstances.
Abstinence would not be required in those cases. What
has kept the Catholic Church from really teaching this strongly?
Yeah, so what has kept the Church from teaching this? That question, let me ask you guys. Why do you think the Church has not taken this on fully? All right, some cowardice, I hear you. I'm afraid there's some truth. Other thoughts?
The Catholic Church has been gradually conformed to the world.
All right, the Catholic Church has been slipping into a kind of conformity to the world. I think there's some truth to that, regrettably. It's hard to go against the current, right?
It goes with cowardice, like fear of having people leave the church because of their beliefs.
Yes, okay, good. There's a fear that we'll lose people, maybe lose money, that people won't donate as much, that kind of thing, yeah?
Because it was not taught well in seminaries, because they thought that maybe that was something that was going to be changed.
Okay, good point. Yes. There was admittedly a certain amount of tumultuousness around Vatican II, right? People misunderstood. People were making predictions. Oh, priests are going to be able to get married. Oh, contraception is no longer going to be. Oh, everything's going to become, a kind of rosy garden and we'll be able to do whatever we want. And of course, all of that was completely untrue, and that's never how the church moves. She never changes 180 degree on any of her fundamental moral teachings. They go right back to Christ himself. But because of some of those misperceptions, I think people sort of got weak-kneed and hesitant to teach with the full-throated authority and beauty of the teaching. So yes, and a failure then to form seminarians, maybe. Although I can tell you, I teach currently in 2 seminaries, and one in Boston, one in St. Louis, Missouri, and the seminarians today, I think, are getting some really excellent formation. So I'm very hopeful about, upcoming generations of young priests.
What is a mortal sin, and is using contraceptives a mortal sin?
So the question is contraception fall under that heading of mortal sin? Well, is it grave matter? Certainly is. The matter is grave. But then the next 2, is there full knowledge? In many, many cases, I don't think there is. And then the question of, is there full consent, freedom to consent? And sometimes there's not that either. There may be misperceptions, there may be pressures in a marriage that people are falling prey to. So that, but if somebody did contracept with clear knowledge and full intent, then yes, it would be a mortal sin. It is grave matter. So, but the question of whether all the conditions are satisfied, you have to, work that through with the confessor, and if they're not met, then it would be less than mortal, but still it's the kind of thing that should be very attentively removed from our personal lives.